Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding me time. This afternoon, I'm going to talk a little about Bidenomics. It's interesting. The President doesn't talk about Bidenomics anymore. He thought about a year ago it'd be a neat thing to talk about, but I guess the problem is reality struck. Just over a month ago, President Biden stood just right in front of where you stand now, Mr. Speaker, in this very chamber to give his State of the Union address. He declared, and I quote, "Our economy is the envy of the world." Well, just today, the Consumer Price Index, a key inflation index, came in, quote, hotter than expected. And oh, by the way, that's not good news for Americans. It actually increased to 3.5%. Again, higher than it's been the past few years. It's been higher than it's been in 40 years. As we all pay more for almost everything in Joe Biden's economy, let's take a really close look at the economy that Joe Biden built. Well, when Joe Biden took office, the national debt was $28.7 trillion, a huge amount of debt. But now it's approaching $35 trillion, or more than $250,000 of debt for every American household. Now, in my district, that debt is higher than the average mortgage in my district. So the average family, actually, the mortgage is the least of their debt worries now. Now it's the federal debt. The CBO projects that by 2031, $2 trillion deficits will be the norm. But I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that as usual, the CBO gets this wrong because this year it's going to be way over $2 trillion. In fact, over the last calendar year, so from last beginning of April to this beginning of April, the federal debt has increased over $3 trillion under Joe Biden's watch. Joe Biden's new spending initiatives, just the new spending initiatives in the budget he just proposed, adds up to a price tag of $5.5 trillion more over the next 10 years. And that's just new spending. That doesn't count the ongoing growth of existing federal programs that he projects in his budget. Together, all this new spending is going to drive up federal deficits to 10% of GDP, a level we have only seen in the modern era during the national emergencies of COVID and World War II. Now, since Joe Biden took office, inflation has risen to historic levels, and make no mistake, Bidenflation is a direct result of Joe Biden and the Democrats' out-of-control government spending. Just a couple of days ago, J.P. Morgan Chase's CEO, Jamie Dimon, no friend of this side of the aisle, warned in a letter to his shareholders that interest rates could rise to 8% or higher. He also mentions drivers of persistent inflation being military conflict throughout the world and fiscal deficits. Well, let me tell you something. The Biden administration are absolute champions of military conflicts throughout the world and fiscal deficits. The bottom line is, as we both know, as we all know, under the last administration, there were no hot wars. The Middle East actually was becoming more peaceful, not less peaceful. The Russians were not advancing in Ukraine. All changed with this administration, and the resulting military spending that's going to be necessary worldwide will drive inflation even higher. And that's not my word. That's the word, again, of the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase. I think a person who understands how this economy works. Now, President Biden's economy is affecting Americans of every age, and we all know it. In fact, according to a recent survey, 1 in 8 retirees now plan to return to work this year because they simply can't afford retirement anymore. Inflation has driven up costs of everything: groceries, gasoline, housing, rent, everything. And a recent study in the Wall Street Journal showed that a $100 grocery list from 2019, and for those of you keeping score, that was during the last administration, now costs $137. And anybody who goes to the grocery store, Mr. Speaker, anybody who's watching us today who goes to the grocery store knows this is true. They know what a loaf of bread costs. They know what a dozen eggs cost. They know what a gallon of milk costs. They know what everything, when they go down the aisles, they know everything is more expensive under Joe Biden's watch. If Joe Biden thinks the economy he built is, quote, such an envy, maybe he ought to take a walk through a grocery store. Within the first 2 years of this administration, Joe Biden and the House Democrats passed their so-called American Rescue Plan. I don't think we feel too rescued, to be honest with you. And the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is the real laugh because everybody knows inflation isn't reduced from where it was in the last administration. And both those send federal government spending sky high. Again, what Jamie Dimon warns us is going to lead to a prolonged inflationary period and high interest rates. Lastly, I want to talk about energy prices. Because when you go to the gas pump, you've got to buy diesel, you got to put in your farm tractor, you got to buy diesel, you put in your truck. You know what it costs now. About 50% more than it did under the last administration. Energy prices, your electric bill, your heating bill, everything is going sky high because of this president's policies. Make no mistake, Joe Biden's out-of-control spending, his spending agenda, and his economic policies have made life simply unaffordable for American families. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.